Welcome to a Modern Nonprofit podcast, powered by the Charity CFO, your compass for creative solutions in running your nonprofit. I'm Tasha Anderson, your host and guide through this nonprofit maze. From fundraising to volunteer management, we've got your back. Join us each episode for fresh, game-changing strategies that can make a real impact. Hi, friends. Welcome back to another episode of a Modern Nonprofit podcast. I am Tasha Anderson, your host, and I am here with a new friend, Miriam Dicks. Miriam, you are the CEO and founder of a company called 180 Management Group. And I, first of all, want to say welcome. I'm excited. I want to hurry up and dive into the conversation. But first of all, welcome. And I'm so excited to have you here and to talk a little bit about operations and the consulting work that you do for nonprofits. So before we dive in, Miriam, welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me today, because I am excited about this conversation as well.
Yeah. So I'm a self-proclaimed operation junkie. Some don't realize that I've spent, I think, close to about 20 years now working exclusively in the nonprofit space. I started in public accounting, and I poked and prodded and pointed out all of the flaws in financial management, financial reporting, and frankly, a lot of operational issues, right? Internal controls, best practices, etc. Well, after I did that, I stepped into a nonprofit leadership role, and I was the CFO and all other things administrative. Many of you all listening can probably relate to that role, and that was HR and IT and accounting, of course, and facilities and a lot of compliance around grants and things like that. And that's when I really fell in love with the operational side of a nonprofit. So I tell people I'm a CPA. Yes, I have an accounting degree, of course, but I'm really an operations junkie. So I feel like I'm in good company here, Miriam.
And you are. I actually believe that, operations and accounting, they just go hand in hand. Like, you can't do one without the other. And so as much as you are an operations junkie, I am becoming an accounting junkie. And I have enrolled myself at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in the Master of Accountancy program, because I've learned over the years how intertwined the two disciplines are. And even working with nonprofits over the last few years, leading a cohort of operations professionals. Within that cohort, we had IT and finance and HR, and they were all a part of what we would call the operations cohort. And so you just really can't have one without the other, right? It's just so
really
diverse.
True.
If someone has a role as a director of operations or a COO, they have to touch, if you will, so many different areas of the organization, because at the core of operations is bringing vision to pass. Right. So being able to see or understand the vision that, the senior leader, the CEO has, or the executive director has, and committing that to a plan that can be implemented and executed so that vision can come to pass. And so that's where you really see the crux of operations, and it just touches all parts of the organization.
Yeah. And with that, accounting or just quantifying things in the way of numbers, here at the Charity CFO, which is the accounting firm that I built after leaving this nonprofit space in that particular role. I've been doing this for about 7 years. And I tell people all the time that accounting is just a means to measure different things. And so to your point, the intersection of all these operational components, I always say, HR and IT and all these other functions that kind of fall under that administrative umbrella, and certainly programmatic operations. I mean, frankly, everything impacts the numbers in some way or another. And so how can operational leaders, whether, like you said, it's a COO or a director of ops, or maybe that's even the CEO kind of functioning as, obviously the director of operations, or all things operational for smaller organizations, understanding how to measure things in a way and create systems of tracking things and knowing, hey, I'm kind of looking down the future and seeing that these things are off track and how to get them on track. And I tell people, maybe it's because I'm a CPA that started my own firm, but we measure everything, not necessarily in dollars, but everything has a number. That's a very simplistic benefit to having everything quantified in numbers. And we measure everything, maybe because we're accountants and we just kind of geek out on the number side of things, but it's amazing what you measure, you pay attention to, and how to leverage. I think a lot of people shy away from using numbers and have this idea, I'm not good at math, or I'm not good at accounting, I'm not good at finance, I'm not a numbers person. But really what you measure and however you measure it, you pay attention to, and that just transforms your operations. I don't know if that's your experience or not, but that's certainly been
definitely. helping organizations to understand what their KPIs are going to be or should be if they don't have them, creating dashboards, metrics, those things are important because, as you said, what you measure, you monitor, right?
Yes. Yes.
And it's difficult to make any sort of real change and lasting impact or even transformation if you don't know where you're starting and where you're going. And having that data, having those numbers, having that information allows you to be able to make decisions that are going to impact your organization favorably. And so definitely, and it's not just about bean counting, right? It's really about making or analyzing the right information for the right time. And I think that's important. For sure.
What's funny, Miriam, you shared with me that you're getting this accounting degree right before we hit record button. So I did not know that I had a fellow aspiring accountant or somebody that understood accounting, I should say. I don't know if we'll go as far as, you wanting to be labeled as an accountant, maybe. Yeah.
Not there yet, but we're getting there.
I could talk all day about like these KPIs and these benchmarks, and I will say, but that's not actually why just exactly why we brought you on to have that conversation. But while we're on it, something that's been on my soapbox lately, since you mentioned KPIs and dashboard, and I'm going to be doing some more conversations around this topic, a couple other platforms that we'll kind of promote later on, but there's this idea I hear all the time, right? We bring on new clients at the charity CFO, or I'm just talking to a passing. It's like, Tasha, what are the benchmarks for the industry, right? And I think that everybody's always struggled with defining what they should be comparing themselves to, and everybody kind of wants to compare just to make sure, like, I've never done this before, or maybe I'm a leader and I've never done this role before, and give me some, bumpers to kind of operate within. Tell me what is on the high end and the low end, so I know kind of where we're measuring up, right? I think it's kind of human nature. And what I've really struggled with is being able to articulate that or define that for all of the different clients. And I'll give you an example. I have two clients that I work with, all things considered from the outside, it's basically a carbon copy of each other, essentially. Two early childhood centers, they both are funded by the same people, similar capacity, similar programming. The biggest differentiator is that one was fairly new, less than 10 years old. One was about 125 years old, right? Well, the one that was 125 years old, even from the outside world, like, they're both preschools, they do the same thing. The one that was 125 years old, probably not a huge surprise, had a pretty robust fundraising plan, right? And actually had cultivated relationships with donors over many years. So because they had so much fundraising support, they were able to start developing additional services. Think about wraparound services, case management, that sort of thing, for the children families they were working with. So if we were to say, here are your benchmarks for the sub-industry of the nonprofit that is the early childhood education space, for example, these are two wildly different organizations. Their budget size is quite a bit different, right? Even though they're serving the same number of kids, they get the same funding source, they're the same size, same metro area, again, funded by the same people, from the governmental side of things. And the point in all of that is, I don't think that, I just think we need to stop looking outward to define those benchmarks, and we need to start thinking inward and start figuring out, what do we want to measure, what's important to us, just to get started. And then you can just keep adding on as it goes. So I'm curious to hear, Miriam, from you. I know this is what you do consulting, operations. How do you get clients to figure that out? Or do you?
I agree with you, because where we really find the inconsistency, even within the same, if you will, sub-sector within nonprofit, is the variation in wraparound services. Right? Because if you were working with, let's say, a CDC, a community development organization or corporation, they may build houses, just like another builds houses. Right. But then another more seasoned CDC may also have an economic development arm. They may also have a community or what do you call it? Leadership program for the community, or they may have some other kind of activity surrounding their core service, right? Maybe it's education in real estate and in home ownership, or whatever the case may be. Well, when you have so many different wraparound services, it is very difficult to say, to compare apples to apples in that regard. But if you were looking at core, we just build houses, then you might have some KPIs for that. But when
Right.
you start adding in all the different wraparound services, that's when you have to look more inward, because that is going to not
Mm-hmm.
only impact the services that you provide, but the culture that's existing within your organization.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so with those drastically different cultures, you need to be looking inside as to how it is that we can develop our own path, our own trajectory, because of the uniqueness that we bring to the market. The
Mm-hmm.
other thing that I also will say is that, having worked with nonprofits in different states, nonprofits are local. So
Mm-hmm.
the way that a nonprofit functions in one state or in
Right.
one county or region is going to be different than another state with another county and another region.
Mm-hmm.
The demographics are different, even if the services are the same. So you
Right.
can't necessarily have the same KPIs because they just don't function the same way. Maybe they're filling
Mm-hmm.
a gap, right? That the government has, that's created because the government is maybe doing pieces and parts of what the community needs. And so you have the nonprofits coming in, filling the gaps. Well, the government is structured differently, right? The programming is
Mm-hmm.
different. The availability of resources is different. So there is only but so far you can go with having
Mm-hmm.
benchmarks and KPIs that are industry wide, but you just have to
Mm-hmm.
kind of choose your battles. Like, what main core or main focus of our organization can we find that is similar to most? And
Right.
then, of course, customize the rest of it because it has
Yeah.
to be.
Right.
And that's
Exactly.
sort of the approach that I take with organizations.
Exactly. And I think because there's so much confusion around which benchmarks are the best, I've seen so many organizations that just don't have any.
Yeah.
There's just no KPIs.
Nope.
We just don't measure anything. And I always say this, I preach this to my team all the time: what you measure, you pay attention to. So we're measuring everything over here. And, I think that there's just this element of, kind of flying without the gears lit up. I'm not a pilot, but, the kind of the visual that comes to my mind, that people feel like they don't have the information. And frankly speaking, I think from the accountant side, Tasha, I need better reporting. I need better reporting. It's like, maybe, but not all of the metrics that you're looking for, not all the data points you're looking for are going to show up on a financial report, frankly. And so I had a conversation. It wasn't a nonprofit. It was another, a friend of mine that owns a private practice. It's not even accounting.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And she was like, Tasha, should I get a different accountant or whatever? And I said, well, what else do you measure? And we were having this conversation, and I said, I mean, maybe you need a new accountant. I don't know, but what you really need is some structure and the different data points that are relevant to you in your business, and the self-discipline to sit down and like look at them every single week, and then do that over a period of time, draw some conclusions on that, and then you can kind of go forth and figure out, all right, what am I going to pay attention to now? Or at least come up with some sort of at least quarterly goals or what have you. Anyway, so
Yeah.
I know that wasn't even why we ended up hopping on
No.
this call today, Miriam, but I
But that could
like
be a
to
full
have
conversation.
it really could. And I had this kind of epiphany a few months ago, as I get this question all the time, and I started talking to everybody I can that kind of operates in this space, and I was like, oh, am I off base here? Is this a thing? And I was like, no, that's pretty,
No.
that's my experience too. So
Yeah.
anyway, I guess before we switch gears, anyone listening, kind of think about what makes sense to you. And it doesn't have to necessarily be money driven. For example, I know, Miriam, we want to talk about some challenges people are having in the recruiting and hiring space. Now people are going,
Mhm.
oh, this is what we came here to talk about, which then is after like, we need to get to talking about counting and numbers. But I will say, at the Charity CFO, we're rapidly growing, and HR. These are numbers I pay very close attention to, right, on the recruiting side of
Mhm.
things,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
how many people are applying, and how does that convert into, we have a series of interviews, and how many people are applying, how many people move on to an interview, and then the next interview, and then end up coming on board, and that helps us anticipate, hey, if I have 2 open positions, I need X amount of applications. And then as I'm having my positions open, are those applications coming in at the rate that we are talking about? So I wanted to share that example because I think people think numbers equals dollars, and dollars shows up on a financial report, and we have to measure things in a way that maybe doesn't make sense for all of us. But this concept should be applied to, frankly, I think all departments, all functions within any business, especially nonprofits. So
Yeah.
that's just one way that we continue to use that. But Going back to the HR and the recruiting issue, I know this is a huge hot topic that I'm having these conversations with our clients all the time. They say to me, Tasha, look, we're not going to meet the budget this year, not because the funding's not available, not because there's certainly no shortage of demand for our services. We cannot find the people. We cannot find the people in this job market to fill the positions that would then render the services to the population we serve. So there's a bunch of people that are kind of dissatisfied with that. That might be your board.
Mm-hmm.
It might be your funders disappointed. Hey, we allocated these resources, you didn't spend it. Certainly, just the team that wants to have the impact in the community is not going to maybe, or at least be at risk for not doing that. So I know you have seen some more challenges, maybe, or different challenges in the nonprofit space with your clients. What's happening with your clients? What's your experience?
So I'm going to back up just a little bit, because I think that our previous conversation about measuring and monitoring and KPIs really comes to bear in when we talk about recruiting. So we talked about how from organization to organization, you have some similarities, but then you have many differences, especially when it comes to the wraparound services. And one of the I think underpinnings of some of the recruitment issues is really going back to connecting vision to our staffing plan and our staffing model. And if we are trying to do so many things as an organization, what typically happens, especially as the organization grows very organically, is that people's roles begin to become very large. They end up being, wearing 20 hats because we have decided to add in all these additional services without having gone back to look at our manpower plan, our staffing plan. And so some of the challenge is and I think where we really should start is understanding why you have the vacancy. Because if we just go straight into let's fill vacancies without having any thought process or any research or analysis done on why we have vacancies, then we're missing some opportunities there. And so there are typically, I'd say maybe 3 or 4 reasons why you may have vacancies, right? One of those reasons is that someone retires.
Sure.
Right. And if someone retires, you may have trouble filling that vacancy if that legacy role is a combination of 3 or 4 roles.
Yeah.
Or if they retire and that particular position really is starting to be a little antiquated because it was the way that the position is named doesn't necessarily fit the skill set that people are coming out of school with today. Right. So that's the retirement piece. But then you may have staff turnover. And if you have high turnover and it's creating, of course, it creates vacancies, then we need to look at the culture that's there within the organization that's creating that high turnover, right? And so you don't want to just immediately plug it in just to experience more turnover. And so so that's another opportunity there. Then the other one is losing folks to better offers. It wasn't necessarily that we were upset with where we were. We just got a better offer.
Sure.
And then, you don't want to just put a job description out there and hire someone and someone else comes and snatches them up. Right. And so there are things that I think culturally that exist within the organization that should be addressed before we run out to recruit. Okay. And so when you look at that cultural standpoint, so from my perspective as an operations consultant, and we talked about this very briefly before we started the recording, is that my previous work in mergers and acquisitions is where I started in the healthcare administration side of the world, working for a nonprofit hospital and in nonprofit healthcare organizations. But I had a lot of responsibility in what we would call the operational due diligence. So prior to acquiring another healthcare entity, right, to absorb into a larger entity, we would do some what we call operational due diligence. Go out to this organization, understand how it functions, look at their policies and procedures, look at best practices, and understand where they were as a smaller entity and what kind of culture exists, so that we could make sure that we could acculturate them into another organization. And so in doing that, it helped me to understand and look at how organizations function operationally and how that impacts their culture. So we look at people, processes, and planning at 180 Management Group. And when you look at those different areas, and when I say planning, really talking about reporting and using that data
Mm-hmm.
for planning purposes, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you look at those components, and organizations will be strong in some of those areas, but what you want is a balance among all three.
Sure.
And typically, you'll have organizations that have high turnover because they're focused on one area and not all three of the areas. So, in other words, there's a lack of structure that goes along with vision that provides people an opportunity to use their skill sets in the right way.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Okay.
And so we try to go in and figure out where that imbalance is so that we can help folks create a plan that makes sense for their people, if you will, when they're looking at filling vacancies. But if I were to, look at an organization and see that they were struggling, the first place I would start is to understand why the vacancy exists. Then that gives us a different vantage point and a perspective as to how do we want to fill that vacancy.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that you say that because I've heard, and I sit on boards. So it's not just clients that I see, kind of behind the scenes what's happening, or I know the staff like really well, because I work with them on a day-to-day basis. But even boards I've seen, when you hear about turnover, so much of what I hear as kind of a different kind of stakeholder is, well, they got the better offer. I'm not going to debate that that is a real thing. I think all businesses struggle with that, for profit or nonprofit, certainly, that especially in this labor market. However, what you were saying about the examples of retirement, or the job just became too big, really, really resonated with me. That is what I found myself in and why I left the nonprofit industry. I've met so many colleagues that it was the same way. Any person that's a leader of any business wants those high performing people. And I tell this to people all the time. So you find a high performing person that's really, really competent, right? And you have this amazing ability to keep being able to give them more and more and more and more things. Not even the volume of tasks, but the breadth, like the broad range of tasks, right? And I don't know if I mentioned earlier when we were recording or not, but I was, all things accounting, finance, IT, HR, facilities, all of those. By the way, no business doing most of those things. I
Right.
figured it out. But what I tell people, you have a really amazing person that's really talented, and high performing people don't like to go home at the end of the day and feel like they did a mediocre job. After a certain point in time, it's like, I'm just not feeling fulfilled because I'm doing all these things I'm not really equipped to do. The sheer volume of my task doesn't even allow me the capacity to even get better at these things. So I'm just holding on, trying to survive in this role. And people get really burnt out. At least that's my experience. And I've talked this with so many different people. And I loved what you said about the job just getting too big. So I'm curious on some of these observations you've had where you've seen these imbalances, or if you've really gotten to the root of why people are leaving. Yes, they might tell you they got a better offer, but it's probably a better offer doing fewer responsibilities. So it's not even just completely tied maybe in the financial aspect. Of course, that probably helps. But Miriam, I'm curious, what are some of the strategies that you've used to kind of help your clients combat these challenges or make these changes?
So starting with that first issue of, the job is too big. When you talk about high performers and them taking on additional responsibilities, they're taking on responsibilities and in a way that complements who they are, right? So the way that you would manage IT, being an accountant, may not be the way someone else would manage an IT department. And what we do is we take everything that you were doing high level, put it into a job description, and then we look for a unicorn.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Right. You're not going to find the unicorn.
Right. Might get lucky once, but once that unicorn burns out.
Well, because you created the unicorn position.
Right.
It didn't start that way. The position started with, maybe 3 or 4 high level responsibilities. And then it ended up with 10. And so now you're looking for someone who's analytical yet creative. Those people don't exist. Like having these sort of conflicting personalities that are necessary to do 20 different jobs. And so we have to really go back to what is the core function of this role, and do we really need to have it as one role, or should it be broken out into different roles? And so we start doing some process mapping and job role. I mean, we really get into what are we trying to accomplish and what's the best way to get that done so that we can have the right positions, the right size, right? And so that's a big part of making sure that we have job descriptions that are applicable to the work and to the mission. Because we could really get away from mission by adding in so many different things to, someone's work or responsibilities, because we want to get the next best shiny thing that's out there, right? And so we have to really look at not having, posting unicorn positions. When it comes to some of those retirement type situations, what succession planning do you have in place that's not just for the CEO? Or for the executive director?
Yep.
One of the questions that we ask when we do assessments, for us, we feel like, in order for us to give you the best advice as consultants, we want to make sure we do an assessment. You don't go to the doctor and say, I'm sick, and they just give you medicine. No, they check your vitals. They assess you to understand what it is that's going on with you so they can give you some good advice and good medicine if you need it. And so we do an assessment. One of the questions that we ask when we do the assessment is, especially for our leaders, if you left your job today, would someone else be able to come in and pick up where you left off? No. And know what to do?
No, we know that.
And the 90% of the time, the answer is no. And so how are we trying to fill a vacancy and we don't know what we're asking people to do, right? And so the succession planning side of that is not just that we have a succession plan for a CEO, but for any of our major positions within the organization where someone has a lot of knowledge about how things work, there should be something written about what is needed from that role. Right. And so developing leaders from within is a great way to fill vacancies. Because you are succession planning, that succession planning model, if you will, should include developing people within your own organization to be able to step in if there is a vacancy. And many times there is no one knows what this other person was doing. It is just lost. That wealth of knowledge is just lost in the organization. So one, make sure we have right size positions and good job descriptions that are not looking for unicorns. Two, make sure we have some succession planning so that when we lose key leaders and key folks in our organization, that we're not losing all of our knowledge. And then three, just making sure that we have the right alignment strategies within the organization. If you are trying to fill some positions within your organization and they don't align to strategy, you're also going to lose people because you can't retain them. Retention is the best way to keep from having to fill vacancies, right?
Yeah, right.
And if you can't retain people, then trying to just put someone in the role again is not going to fix the problem. You're going to have to make sure that the role is aligned properly within the organization and that people know that they have a place to go when I say place to go, they can move up in the organization. This is why people leave. I think there's a statistic out there that says that most people who do leave voluntarily from one organization, from a nonprofit organization to another, it's like 34% are leaving because they don't see a path forward.
Sure.
I'm in this role, I'm stuck in it. And on top of that, you've given me 20 more responsibilities to do, and I'm not getting necessarily the new titles or the bump in pay or any of that. Right. And so having the alignment there and to make sure you can retain talent is also going to be helpful. Now, if all else fails from internal, I always try to get those internal strategies first because it's expensive externally to go to a recruitment firm.
Yeah, I know that.
Right. So yes, you can go to a recruitment firm. But again, if you don't have some of these other things put in place internally, you're going to be wasting money. Right. Yes, you can outsource. Sometimes if you go back to the alignment, if you go back to, strategic planning and manpower plans, you might find that when you start looking at processes and what the work actually is, that you could call out some of that work and outsource it. And it might be at least less expensive than actually hiring a full-time staff member. So that is an option, but it takes some analysis, right?
Yeah.
And so really just getting there and analyzing your organization. Why do we have the vacancy? Looking at those different possibilities, and even then sort of tracing it back to, mission and vision and manpower plans will really, I think, help an organization better than just finding the people and experiencing the same problems over and over and over again. So I hope that was helpful.
No, that was helpful. I'd love to hear a little bit more about, let's say outsourcing is not an option, or maybe outsourcing and then it kind of leads into restructuring. But going back to some of that retention conversation, I just have so many thoughts. Actually, scratch that. I want to go back to this idea that I think is the obvious question that people might be asking on kind of right sizing jobs and not creating these unicorn positions. And I think the objection I'm sure you hear is that sounds great, but how do we afford that? Because I know that's certainly something that I've called out in times. It's like, well, Tasha, you've seen our numbers, the budget. Like, how are we going to be able to carve that out if we wanted to create these right-sized positions? I'm curious to know your response to that.
Well, one is, how do you afford turnover?
Right.
Because turnover is expensive.
Absolutely.
So the time that it takes you, one, to recruit someone, onboard someone, train them, and then they leave, you're doing that again. And so it becomes a sort of this, the perspective of efficiency, right? So either you're going to spend money on one end or you're going to spend on the other.
That's right. That's absolutely right. Yeah, absolutely.
And so that's sort of my response to it, because at the end of the day, if you don't take the time to really get to the root cause of the issues of vacancies, then you're going to repeat it. And it's expensive to do that. You might find, if you restructure, have realignment, all those things, that you might have had some things that you're asking people to do that were unnecessary. And so you're freeing up time,
right,
to give people the right work to do and to hire the right staff members.
Gotcha.
So that's part of what we discuss, because at the end of the day, if you just look at the numbers without looking at the work, without looking at the plans, without looking at the strategies, without looking at the processes, then you may be missing what the numbers are telling you. And you need to have that deeper dive.
When you work with clients, Miriam, who's doing this kind of thinking analysis typically? Do you typically work directly with the CEO?
Yes, or COO.
Yeah.
I'm typically working with COOs, CEOs, directors of operations, those folks.
Sure.
Maybe the positions vary so much from organization to organization. It could be a director of administration. It could be a senior director of operations and finance, because the roles are so, different. But typically, yes, that's who I'm working with.
Yeah. And the reason why I ask that, because I'm not sure as leaders, we're always thinking about this idea as the organization grows. Do we need to restructure how we're, organized from an organizational chart perspective? If the jobs need to evolve and change, do we just keep plugging in new positions as it becomes painfully obvious we need someone in that seat? I'm just curious, is that something that's a bit of a surprise to your clients, that, hey, part of your job as C-suite, whether it's CEO, COO, or, some sort of equivalent title, that it is their responsibility to have that vision for how the organization is going to be structured and what positions make sense to create kind of that optimal, makeup or operational efficiency within an organization? Is that a bit of a surprise to people?
What is a surprise is that we will, let's say an organization's leader, CEO, senior leader, has been very intentional about having a strategic plan updated every 2 to 3 years. The surprise is that we didn't include a manpower plan in that.
Yeah,
that's where they're surprised. Like, why didn't we think that we didn't need that? Or why didn't we think to do that? Because that's not typical nonprofit jargon.
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
A manpower plan. Like that's typical, more corporate type talk. And so, having a great mission and vision is always, the warm and fuzzies of why we get into
Mhm.
doing this work. But knowing who we need to actually accomplish it and make sure that every year, as we are thinking about the new, wonderful, great things that we can do for our community, that we're also thinking about the
Mhm.
people who we need to do that,
Yeah.
to actually execute that work. And that's where the
Yeah.
surprise is. It's like, wow, why
Mhm.
didn't we think about that when we did our strategic planning work?
Yeah. You just reminded me of a conversation I found myself in. I was participating in a board meeting once, and we presented these very lofty goals. Lots of growth in program, going to grow a little bit in the administrative infrastructure. Um, and I laugh because of your background in healthcare administration, and the treasurer had asked for a manpower plan. I think he even used those words, but more or less like, okay, all of this growth, have we actually considered the positions, not just on the direct program side, because it's, listed in detail in the grant application,
Right, right.
but all of the other components that
Mm-hmm.
such a significant growth is going to requires some sort of structural changes, I'm sure. Where is that plan and who's going to be responsible for what? And it was really interesting. It wasn't really the leadership of the organization with respect to, the actual executive director. It was other board members. Well, we're just a nonprofit. We're not, we can't
Yes.
expect them to have that. And
Mm, mm,
he's like, well, like, yeah, I know I come from a big, healthcare institution. However, like, you do kind of have to think these things through. And I think the biggest takeaway for me, having a growing business, I went from 7 years ago, just me, to now about 50 employees. And that manpower plan and that org chart, I felt like needed to be reevaluated every 6 months. It's
yeah,
exhausting. But when you're
it's
rapidly
good.
growing,
Mm-hmm.
you always have to be looking at it. Does this make sense? Does this make sense? So,
Yeah. And what we say is that growth puts pressure on your existing systems, right? So
mhm,
just like if you had pipes in your house and you had more water flowing through them than you used to have because you have more usage, then you're going to start having
mhm,
leaky pipes after a while because you don't have the right system in place to carry the water. And
yeah.
so, when it comes to the organization, that's kind of where we specialize. When we are out
Mhm,
mostly working with organizations who are experiencing high growth. They're not necessarily having problems because they're doing so poorly. It's because they've grown so fast that they have outpaced
mhm,
their structure. And we're coming in to help them restructure, transform, if you will, their culture, because a big part of restructuring is cultural transformation. You
mhm,
can no
mhm.
longer do things like you used to do them when it was just 2 people or 5 people. Now that you have a
Mhm,
team of 20 people. And how do you move
mhm,
people, or how do you get people to really understand this new way of communicating, this new way of working together, this new culture that exists because we are bigger than we used to be. And so the
yeah.
work of cultural transformation and restructuring is really the crux of what we do at 180 Management Group.
Well, I can think of numerous nonprofits that I've heard in bits and pieces that, could benefit from just having a second set of eyes look at this and really kind of challenging us on some of these things. And I know we've only kind of hit the tip of the iceberg with the work that you do and all of the different scenarios you probably find yourself in with organizations of all different circumstances, right? Whether it's from
Mm-hmm.
growth or, like you said, change in senior leadership or shrinkage, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure all kinds
Mm-hmm.
of different scenarios that you find yourself in. So I'd love to hear maybe a little bit more about 180 Management Group does, because I know we're kind of, we could talk all day about these things, I think. And then more importantly, how can people get in touch with you that are listening? Like, all of these things sounds like exactly what my organization needs. Or, Miriam, great point. I have a strategic plan, or we're in the middle of that. We haven't even considered operational infrastructure and what those changes are going to look like, even though we all know we need to do something differently. So tell us a little bit more about the work that you do at 180, and then how do we get in touch?
Sure. So, as I said a little earlier, we are a boutique operations consulting firm
Mm-hmm.
specializing in with nonprofit organizations, and what we also offer is leadership development and coaching. And this is why.
Mm-hmm.
we can work with an organization to help them transform their operations and restructure and have a cultural transformation. But if leaders aren't built alongside with building all the processes, then we find that we could build something that someone can't manage, right? And that is not where we want to be. We want to make sure that when you are growing, when you are in need of transformation, that not only are we looking at the processes, we're actually helping to transform people, because people run your organization, not the processes, right? And so that is part of the work that we do in transforming organizations. You can definitely, hear more about the work that we do. And we may offer from time to time some masterminds and things like that to help leaders, come outside of the box with other leaders. And a lot of that information you're going to find on LinkedIn. So you can go to LinkedIn and you can look for Miriam Dicks. I think it might be Miriam P. Dicks on LinkedIn, or 180 Management Group on LinkedIn. Any of the events that podcast maybe that we have participated in, any masterminds that we have coming up, any opportunities for retreat planning or anything like that, any education that we provide. A lot of that is out there on LinkedIn. So go ahead and visit us on LinkedIn. If you want to get in touch with us directly for a consultation, 180managementgroup.com, 180managementgroup.com.
Okay.
And you can get, directly to us for an operational consultant or consultation or leadership consultation or anything like that. So definitely visit us online and on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Well, that's good. We love resources. So go and check out LinkedIn for those resources. And then also, as you mentioned, your website. So we'll be sure to include all of that in the show notes so that you all that are listening can find that. But Miriam, before we end, again, thank you. I've just had so many this person knows what I'm talking about, or we are kindred spirits. We definitely have had some of the same experiences, and I love sharing some of these kind of aha moments with people that might be listening and are struggling. It's like, why isn't this, evolving or changing, or why can't we get past this place? And I think that probably some of this that we've talked today, and probably more that you will share in some, like you said, some of your master classes and things like that, will help people hopefully make some changes that they need. So thank you again for joining us. And for all of you listening, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel if you found this content helpful. I know that you can listen to this on audio. You can also head over to YouTube and watch this in video clips if that is of interest to you. Do me a favor though, just like or engage with it in some way, because when you do that, other nonprofit organizations can find content just like this that helps them better run a more modern nonprofit. So until next time, thanks, friend.
That's all we have for you today. Once again, I'm Tasha Anderson with the Charity CFO, and this is A Modern Nonprofit Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to A Modern Nonprofit Podcast on all major streaming platforms so you will stay notified for when the latest episode drops, which will help you stay in the know about anything nonprofit related. Also, join our community on Facebook by searching for A Modern Nonprofit Podcast and follow us on all of our social media accounts. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.